Welcome to Reach Tips of the Day. Today's topic is syringe button replacement. Here for an example, we have two different syringes. We have an Adec syringe and we have a DCI syringe. The buttons are a little bit different on replacement. On the Adec syringe, there is a screw in the middle that holds the buttons, and on the DCI, there's a pin on the side. On this Reach Tips, we're going to focus on the Adec syringe. And we'll do another video on the DCI syringe. So when you're trying to replace the buttons, well, first off, the reason you want to replace the buttons, think of the buttons as an on-off valve. If the syringe is not being used and you get some kind of dripping going on, then it's the buttons. The buttons are sticking down and they need to be replaced. Some offices, some people will rebuild them. It's very time consuming, and if one part is bad, then I'd recommend just replacing the whole button. So Adec buttons are pretty easy to replace. If you go through all the steps, you need a small Allen wrench, 0.050 size, a standard, and you put it inside the screw. Make sure it's set in there nice and snug so you're not stripping the screw, and go ahead and loosen it. And also, before you do this, always press down on the air button and the water button to make sure there's no pressure. It's depressurized. Go ahead and take the screw out. Sometimes they come out easily by just with your fingers pulling them out, and sometimes you have to do them with a little bit of convincing by putting a little tool underneath and working the screw out, the syringe button out. So what you end up with is you have your conical springs underneath each button, and what you can do is when you once you get all those out, the buttons and the springs, you can take a Q-tip, a cotton tip applicator, and clean inside those where the buttons go. Make sure it's nice and clean. Replace the spring with the point side up, and when you push them down inside there, you want to look down and make sure that the springs are nice and centered and pointing straight up and not leaning to one side. And then you want to take your new buttons and use a little bit of lubricant. A lot of offices have the Adec silicone lubricant. You want to use silicone lubricant. But you can also, if you don't have that, you can also buy silicone grease in your local hardware store. But a little dab of silicone lubricant and roll it around on your fingers, and then roll it around on the buttons. Get a little bit of lubricant on those buttons. And then again, the springs are nice and straight up and down. Push the buttons down inside. Okay? Now here's the tricky part. The tricky part is getting this screw back inside, in between the buttons. You can't go directly in because the screw head won't fit past the buttons, so you have to fit it underneath the button head and into the hole where it screws into. So it's kind of a balancing effort where you put your screw in. You can kind of help do that by using your Allen wrench. But then you need to push your buttons underneath the button. There's a little ledge. You kind of push your button down in the hole, and that lets your screw grab onto the threads and then slowly tighten. If there's any resistance, that means your buttons aren't seated correctly, and you need to make sure that they're seated correctly. Don't force that screw in. It should screw in very easily. But that's the syringe button replacement on an Adec syringe.